Hey everyone, George here and welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be doing a species profile on the Rummy nose tetra. Now this is not just any species profile, this is quite literally a species profile that is a matter of life and death for these particular fish. These fish can be extremely delicate in the first 48 to 72 hours of putting them into your tank. Today we're going to be talking about how you can prevent what I call new tank syndrome for these fish, and we'll get back to that in just a minute here. So what is new tank syndrome when it comes to the rummy nose tetra? Well, first of all, rummy nose tetras are not a fish that travel well. In other words, they do not do well coming from the Amazon or from a breeder's tank to your supplier. In other words, new tank syndrome, meaning that these fish have a tendency to have a hard time adapting to a new tank. Now, there's a couple of reasons for that, and I'm going to try to explain that to you today. Number one, I recommend, first of all, that you do not get tank raised rummy nose tetras, because they have been bred so heavily that most of them do not do very well in tanks. I would prefer, if you can, to get some wild caught fish. You can get them. They're a little bit more expensive, but they are also a lot more hardy. Their immune systems are just way better than a tank raised fish. How do you get these? First of all, talk to your supplier. Find out if his fish are tank raised or whether or not he is getting these from a supplier that gets them directly from the South American Amazon basin around Brazil and Argentina. It's very important to understand that these are for sure wild caught fish, and he would know that, or he or she would know that, and give you some idea as to whether or not you are getting a high quality fish. First things you want to look for is to see if the fish are healthy. Make sure they don't have any ick. These particular fish are very susceptible to a couple of diseases, and the main one is ick. And that's something that's going to show up in a tank within like 48 to 72 hours. If your supplier is doing what they're supposed to do and they are putting these guys in quarantine, you should be able to go back and watch that tank over 4 days to 7 days to make sure that these fish show no signs of ick. If you have a good supplier and somebody that you can count on, you should be able to do that without that person feeling uncomfortable with you doing that. So, like I said, look for signs of ick, look for signs of what appears to be a fish that is really skinny and starving. Now, all of the fish in the tank that you're looking at right here are wild caught fish. And that doesn't mean that I don't get tank raised fish. It just depends on the breed. But every one of the ones that are rummy nose tetras in this tank and the bloodfin tetras are all wild caught. So that is very important. So the next thing we're going to talk about is how you need to have a tank that is well established before you ever put these in a tank at all. And we'll get back to that in just a second here. Now, I do not recommend these fish for beginners. If you're someone who is just getting into the hobby, I really don't recommend that you take on rummy nose tetras. As I said, they're a fish that if you are not careful and have a well-established tank, you're not going to have success with these fish. And I've learned that the hard way early on in this hobby by losing some of these fish by not paying attention to some of the very basic things that you need to know to make sure that these fish thrive in your tank. Now, when I talk about an established tank, I'm not talking about a tank that has been cycled for 4 to 5 weeks. I'm talking about a tank that has been established for 4 to 5 months. I would not put these fish in anything less than that, because they are very susceptible to problems with water parameters, with any kind of dirty water whatsoever. You need a tank that is well established and is filtering really well, and one that is had life in it for a while. Now, when I talk about a tank that is established, I don't mean that you can't have other fish that have been in the tank. In fact, I recommend that you make sure that the tank has had maybe 4 or 5 cories in there, some Siamese algae eaters, some autocinclids, things that are going to keep your ammonia, or not your ammonia, but your algae down in that tank and prevent some of that diatom algae from growing. I don't see that in my tank simply because I put these kinds of fish in here along with maybe some snails as well that do keep all of that stuff at bay long before I ever put fish in there. Now, that's something that you have to be patient with. If you're not a patient person, then you don't want to try to put these kinds of fish in an established tank, even, because you have to be very patient and you have to understand that these fish can be extremely susceptible to, like I said, ick and actually some internal parasites as well. And again, make sure you're getting wild caught fish. The other thing that you want to make sure of in your tank is that you have the ability to have lots of hiding places for these fish. They are shoal type fish. They do not school in the traditional sense. They shoal in the tank, and they do really keep the middle part and the lower part of the tank occupied, whereas the redfin blood tetras in here, they occupy the middle and the upper part of the tank, and they do real well with the rummy nose. So these are two fish that are very compatible with each other, and you can put some other fish in there as well that are non-threatening, not very large or anything like that, that are going to be intimidating to the rummy nose and keep that stress level down. And that is the key to the whole thing, is making sure that these fish are not stressed out in any way, shape, or form, because like I said, in that first 48 to 72 hours, they can be extremely susceptible to ick, and that is something that I have lost early on. I would say I lost probably 15 or 20 of these fish several years ago, and this is the first time, to be honest with you, that I've tried these fish again, and it's because I've learned a lot about them before ever adding them to my tank. Now, this is a tank that is not going to have anything in here except for the rummy nose tetras, the bloodfin tetras, and I do have some killies in here, some gardenia killies, a male and 2 females, but I also have, like I said, the cories, the autocinclids, and the Siamese algae eaters, which are all contributing to a very well balanced ecosystem in here. The next thing I want to talk about is water changes. It is so important that you're doing a third water change at least once a week. If you can, try to do it twice a week. If you do it twice a week, your tank is going to be in pristine shape. The one thing you want to make sure also is that you have a well-planted tank. Now, when we come back, we're going to talk about how you hardscape a tank for these kinds of fish, and we're going to get back to that in just a second. Now, the type of tank that these fish are going to require is one where you have a lot of hardscape in here, or places for these fish to hide, but you want that hardscape in here to be a low profile. You don't want it to be high in the tank. You need a place for these fish to swim and have open spaces, but you also want to have a well-planted tank. So you can see here that this tank is completely covered with plants on the bottom. In fact, I will be adding some more plants to this today that I just got, and these fish have now been in here about a couple of weeks now, and they're doing fine. I've seen no signs of ick or any of the other problems that are something that you might see with these particular fish. I do have one that got picked on a little bit. He was a little bit of a smaller guy, but he seems to have been holding his own here, and that just seems to happen. There is a pecking order, just like there is with any kind of fish, so it's very, very important that you look for those kinds of things. If you see something like that happening, or you see fish off someplace by themselves or hanging out at the top, that means that there's something wrong. Get that fish out of there, put them in a quarantine tank, grow them a little bit more before adding them back into the school or the shoal, whatever you want to call it, because it's going to be very important that fish gets a little bit more size to it before you add it back into the tank. Now, as I said, it's so important to make sure that you have a well-planted tank, and the reason for that is because you are going to have plants in there that are going to absorb a lot of the organics that break down and the fish put off, such as their feces and their urine. Yes, fish do urinate just like humans, just like any other creature on the planet. They do release urine into the water. Now, all of these pieces of organics can be picked up and used by the plants. So if you have a well-balanced system, you have a good cycle here where fish are giving off waste, the waste is being used by the plants are giving off oxygen, and then you come full circle and you have a very well balanced, can't talk, crystal clear tank. As you can see, the water in all of my tanks in every video that you see is absolutely perfectly clear, because I am very careful about water changes, number one, and I plant the living heck out of tanks just simply because I know that those plants are so important to the well-being and longevity of these fish. Now, as far as diet goes, we're going to get back to that in just a second and talk about what I think is the best diet for these fish to keep them going long term, because they do have a lifespan of up to 6 to 8 years if they're well cared for. And we'll get back to that in just a second and talk about it. So as I said, diet is also very important for these fish. If you can get them eating within the first 24 hours, you have a really, really good chance of having a successful tank full of these fish. Now, if they're not eating within 48 hours, I would be very, very concerned about that. I would check my water parameters to make sure that everything is okay. Of course, before you even put the fish in here, you should be checking those water parameters anyway and doing a really good water change within 24 to 48 hours of putting these fish in here. So as far as diet goes, these guys will eat pretty much anything. They'll eat flake foods, they'll eat pellets, they'll eat anything that'll fit in their mouths as long as it is small enough for them. And they are voracious eaters. They really, really do eat quite a bit. Now, the one thing that you want to remember is to get a good quality food. We have the tendency to buy cheaper foods sometimes, and that really does not contribute to the long-term health of these fish. What I recommend is buying some fish foods that are high in omega-3s, high in nutrients, and high in other things that make these fish pop as far as color goes. Now, the one thing about the rummy nose tetra is a good indicator is the very thing that they are named after, the rummy nose. So if you look at that nose and it's dull in color and the fish is acting funny or whatever, then there's something wrong with that particular fish. So what you want to do is to be careful to pay attention to the color of the nose on these fish. If they're really bright in color, they're happy. They're happy to be in this tank, and they're going to do really, really well. Now, as I said, these come from South America, from Brazil, Argentina, the Amazon basin. So they're fish that do not like a tremendously hard water. They like a softer water that's a little bit more acidic, a pH around 6.8 to 7.2 at the most. If you can keep that at about 7.0, which is basically neutral. There are some sea chem products out there called Regulator that will help you do that. I have found that my water here is basically running between 6.8 and 7.0 anyway, so I don't need to do that. But it's very important to make sure that you are checking that water before you buy these fish, because hard water is not going to kill them right away, but it is certainly going to shorten their lives. Anyways, we're going to wrap this video up in a second here. I just thought this was an important video to do on this particular species because rummy nose tetras, I know many of you out there have contacted me and asked me why you're losing these particular fish. And the bottom line is that you're not the only one, and because of what I have been through and the experiences I've had with them, I want to make sure that you are getting the information that is going to help you to keep these fish healthy in your tank and not, like I said, not put them in too quickly or be impatient. This is not a beginner's fish. This is a fish that absolutely needs to be placed into a tank where it is well established, like I said. And like I said again, not just a cycle tank, but one that has been established for 4 or 5 months. I'm going to wrap this up in just a second here and summarize it, so stick with me and I'll be right back. So in summation here, when I'm talking about the rummy nose tetra, I'm talking about an absolutely beautiful fish that anyone can keep in their tank as long as they follow some basic rules. And those rules I've basically set out for you here as to how you need to handle these. Again, these are not for beginners. A lot of people would like to throw these into their tank because they're such a nice looking fish. But if you don't have any experience in the hobby, I really don't recommend it. Again, you need to have a well-established tank, one that has been cycled and established for 4 to 5 months. This will prevent these fish from getting ick or being shocked when they're put in there. The other thing that I recommend is being extremely careful about making sure you acclimate these fish correctly. You also need to understand that shocking them just for a short period of time, whether that be for temperature or water parameters that are so different than where they came from, can be extremely difficult on these fish and not give them a really good head start on thriving in your tank. So following these rules is going to help you have a wonderful experience with what I think is one of the most beautiful fish from the Amazon basin area, and that is the rummy nose tetra. And they really are beautiful fish. They're so fun to watch. Now, this is a 20-gallon cube. I recommend a minimum of 20 gallons for these fish, of a school of up to 7 to 12 of them. And of course, you got to take into consideration any other fish that you might be putting in here as well. But I push the envelope a little bit. I don't recommend you do that, because if you don't have experience, then you might overload the organics in your tank and cause it to crash. So just be extremely careful when adding these. Be very slow to add water into the bag that they come in over a 2 or 3 hour period. If you need to add an air stone in there while you're acclimating them, that's something I recommend. But these are all great tips, and I hope that you have fun with this amazing little fish called the rummy nose tetra. It took me a long time to figure these fish out, and now that I have, I wanted to share it with you because I thought it was really important. I've gotten a lot of questions about this because I've showed this tank a couple of times, and people have asked me, how do you keep rummy nose tetras? I just can't seem to keep them without them dying. Well, I hope I've helped you with that today. Don't forget to hit the like. Don't forget to subscribe. Also put your comments down below. We do have a giveaway coming up here in the next month or so on a new build that we're doing. And also tell your friends and share this video with your friends. And I hope that you will do that, because new subscribers really help me to keep this channel going. Hit the bell up here so that any new content that I have coming out, you'll be getting that. Thanks for joining me today. Enjoy these amazing fish, the rummy nose tetra. And if you have any questions, leave it in the comments down below and I will get back to you. We'll see you on the next one. Until then, we're out of here.